Hello everyone, it's Terrence here with fishnetproductions.com and welcome to my series on reverb. Now in this series we're going to dive deeply into some of the many uses of reverbs. We'll discuss things like sitting instruments and vocals in a mix with reverbs, sonic layering, also known as stacking reverbs, the different types of reverbs like convolution and calculated reverbs, and how much reverb to use. We'll also talk about the common parameters of reverb and reverb placement, such as using bus or aux sends versus placing reverb directly on a track. We'll be talking about this and a whole lot more. So in today's video, we'll sort of give a broad overview of reverb while also discussing its purposes and its parameters and its common knobs. So let's jump right in. Now, I like to think of reverb in this way. Reverb is to a track or mix what makeup is to a woman's face, or a man's face if you're into that sort of thing. But no matter the complexities or the qualities of a person's face, makeup always seems to add a little extra flair. So reverb can do this same thing for a track or a mix. Now conversely, as with makeup, reverb in extremely large quantities can mess up an already great sounding track or mix. Have you ever seen a person who wears too much makeup? Sticks out like a sore thumb, huh? So with that said, let's get into some of the uses of reverbs. So by now, if you've seen any of my prior videos, you'll know that I have a sort of mantra of having a reason to use any tool or effect that you put on a track or mix when you're mixing. And reverb in that respect is no different. So I've broken reverb down into four main uses. Now the first use is using reverb to create a sense of space for a mix or a track. So I have a track here that I'm working on for a client and I have a pretty good mix going on it so far. I don't have any reverb used on any of the tracks or the mix right now. So I'll let you take a listen to it and listen to the sort of disconnectedness of the tracks, the instruments and the vocals in the mix. In a box to collect whenever you wanted it, but I'll be gone before you know it. So I have here the Waves IR verb and I have it set to a room setting and I have all of these tracks bussed to this one reverb. Now we're simply going to use this reverb to just create a sense of space for this entire mix. So I have it dialed into a moderate setting of reverb here and I'll let you hear what that sounds like. I'll loop this section of the track here, so I'll play it one time with the reverb off and then I'll turn it on and then you can hear the difference. So what you're listening for is the spaciousness of the track. It'll give the track a sense of everything being in the same room when it's played versus the disconnectedness. Okay, so I'll start with it off and then I'll turn it on the next run. In a box to collect whenever you wanted it, but I'll be gone before you know it. You thought you had me wrapped up like a gift in a box to collect whenever you wanted it, but I'll be gone before you know it. Now the second reason or purpose to use a reverb in the second category that I have is to add a special effect for a track or for a mix. Now there are many different special effects that have been created with reverb and I'll just deal with one here and it's the gated reverb effect. Now this effect was very popular in the 80s and was likely made popular by Phil Collins, who was known to have this effect on his drums. But this effect is still really popular today, but it's just used in a few different ways and in lesser degrees than it was in the 80s. So I'll let you hear what that sounds like. So what I have here again is another reverb. I have the lexicon verb and I have it set to a plate gate preset setting on here. And I have the snare drum bussed to this reverb here. So I'll just solo the snare drum and I'll let you hear that dry. I'll play a couple of hits and I'll let you hear what that reverb sounds like. Okay, now here I should also sort of give a definition of what a special effect reverb is. A special effect reverb is basically any type of reverb that has been manipulated or changed from its sort of natural state. So in this instance, you have a gated reverb. We've taken a reverb and placed another effect on top of it, which would be a gate, and manipulated the reverb from there. So it creates a very different effect than what would have been if you were in a sort of natural room. Now, again, there are some rooms that sort of simulate these kind of effects as well, but just for the purposes of this video, I wanted to define that for you. Now, the third purpose or category of reverbs is to make a track sound wider, bigger, or deeper. So I have here the stock reverb in Cubase called Revelation. It's a really good reverb, and it's right now I'm using it as a stereo verb, and I have this vocal track, which is a mono track, bust to this stereo reverb. So watch how this reverb basically creates a stereo spectrum from this mono track. So I'll solo this vocal track and you'll listen to it, and I'll just play a little bit of it, and then I'll turn the reverb on and you can hear how it just spreads across the stereo spectrum. All right, check it out.
You thought you had me wrapped up like a gift in a box to collect whenever you wanted it, but I'll be gone before you know it.
So you see how that just immediately made that track bigger and deeper and wider across the stereo spectrum. Now let's demonstrate that with the whole mix in and see what that sounds like with the mix.
You thought you had me wrapped up like a gift in a box to collect whenever you wanted it, but I'll be gone before you know it.
Now with the third category of reverb, it created this width from left to right, this height from top to bottom, and this sort of depth or deepness. Now with this fourth category and purpose of reverb, it's going to be to create a sense of front to back by moving a track back in a mix. So what I have here is the true verb from Waves. I have the bass track bust to this reverb, and yes guys, you can put reverb on your bass. So the bass is in mono, and I have it bust to a mono verb because I don't want to stereo my bass. I just want to kind of move it back in the track a little bit to demonstrate that here. So let me solo this bass and I'll let you hear what this sounds like as it is with the dry signal, and then I'll turn the reverb on so you can hear what it does. Now what you're listening for is what happens is this bass track is basically sitting right in your face. So just kind of close your eyes and listen to it and imagine it sitting right directly in front of your nose. And when I engage this reverb, you'll hear it kind of move away from your face a little bit. So have a listen to that. Now let's hear what that sounds like in the track.
You thought you had me wrapped up like a gift in a box to collect whenever you wanted it, but I'll be gone before you know it. You thought you had me wrapped up like a gift in a box to collect whenever you wanted it, but I'll be gone before you know it.
Now this effect is sort of a subtle effect depending on how much of the reverb you use, and of course on a bass track you generally don't use that much reverb. Just use it enough to where it sits an instrument back in a track. Now that's the whole purpose of it. So it was a very subtle effect here, but if you were listening you could hear it. Okay, next up I want to talk about some of the common parameters and knobs on a reverb. Now, sorry I have all of these reverbs here kind of jumbled up on a screen for you, but I really want to show you how a lot of these knobs are very common to reverbs. However, before we do that, I want to talk very briefly about the progression and succession of reverb over the past few decades, because I think it's important to realize where we are in terms of use of reverb right now. Now, in the 80s, reverb was a very audible effect and could be heard all over tracks in a mix. If you listen to any of the 80s stuff, you'll pretty much hear where reverb was used. It was a very audible effect. Now, the 90s sort of birthed this just enough to hear it kind of reverb thing. So you knew the reverb was there and it was slightly audible, especially on the loud hits and shouts and stuff from vocals like that. Now, the late 90s and the early thousands sort of birthed the dry mix and the put enough to barely hear it and then back off a few dB kind of thing. So I don't know if you guys remember that, but around the early thousands, there were, mixes got really, really dry and really close and really, really upfront. That was the very popular thing. Now, over the past 7 or 8 years, we've been slowly getting back to that sort of 90s vibe of just enough to hear it. And the home recording revolution has sort of made it okay to use reverb even more and make it even more audible. Now, this information is important because it sort of gives you a gauge of what's commonly used in reverb. So if you want to, match what's common when you're using your reverbs in terms of how much to use, you can think about where we are in terms of reverbs. Now, let's jump into the common knobs and parameters of reverb plugins. Now, it should be stated here that there are various types of reverb plugins, and these types can differ in many, many ways. So we'll simply discuss the most common knobs and parameters here. So the first knob that we'll talk about is the decay or the reverb time. Now, both of these terms are sort of interchangeable. You'll see them in pretty much all reverbs. There, as you see here on the IR verb, there's your reverb time setting here. On the lexicon verb, you have reverb time here. On the true verb, you have the decay time here, which again is interchangeable with time. On the Cubase reverb, you have the main time here. So basically what reverb decay or reverb time is the amount of time that it takes for reverb reflections to die away. So if you're in a room and you clap, it's the amount of time that you stop hearing those reverberations in that room. Now, the next most common knob we have is the pre-delay knob. Now, basically what pre-delay is the time between the direct sound and the start of the reverb. So for instance, again, if you're standing in a room, say a gym, and you clap your hands, it's the amount of time between the time you actually clap your hands and that reverb starts. Now, what this is good for is lead instruments that you want to appear closer but still sit in the mix, say a vocal. So it's very good for lead instruments. So as you'll see here, it's a very common knob on the IR verb. We have the pre-delay setting right here that can be adjusted. Same thing here on the lexicon verb. We have a pre-delay setting here. Same thing on the Cubase reverb, the pre-delay setting here, and the exact same thing on the true verb with the pre-delay setting here. So it's a very common knob. Now, the next common knob on reverbs is the density and diffusion knobs. Now, these are two separate knobs, but I want to kind of talk about them together because they directly correlate to each other. Now, it's very hard to explain in concrete terms what these two things are, but basically the density refers to how tight or how close the reflections are. So it's generally thought that lower densities sound good on things like vocals and long sustaining instruments like strings and pads and stuff like that. And higher densities are good for short staccato sounds like percussion and drums. Now, diffusion determines the rate at which the reflections increase in density. So you'll see here on these reverbs, we have a density setting here on the true verb. We have a diffusion setting here on the lexicon verb, and this also has a density setting too, just depending on which reverb you're using, and you can change these parameters in this reverb how you want. But also on the Cubase reverb, we have a density knob here, and we don't have either of those buttons on this IR verb. But those two knobs are very, very common to reverbs. So what I suggest is you kind of play with them on your tracks and try to find out what they do for yourself. It's really kind of hard to explain, but again, the density just refers to how tight or how close the reflections are. So I guess that would be if you're in a smaller room, the reflections from that room will actually be a lot closer. And the diffusion determines how fast or how slow the reflections increase in that density. All right, guys, so that'll do it for this first video in the series on reverb. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and I hope you have gotten something out of it to take back to your own mixes and apply and, help make you a better mixer. Now, join me in the next video where I'm going to be talking about sonic layering, better known as stacking reverbs. Now, that's a very common thing that we do nowadays. So we'll talk about some uses of that and the best way to approach it and just some of the effects of it. And also, guys, make sure you go subscribe to the channel. Hit that subscribe button right up at the top right of the page. You'll see it there. Make sure you subscribe because you'll get the notifications of when these videos come out. And if you're enjoying them and if you want more of them, you'll see them here right on my channel. So make sure you hit that subscribe button again, and I'll see you guys in the next video.